As soon as Mrs. Billings dismissed the class, Pickle grabbed his robot and jumped up. He did this every day because this was the last class before lunch. Pickle loved to eat. That was the only other thing he had going for him. Pickle ate more than Shelley and Reed combined, and he didn't have much more meat on him than his metal skeletal robot did. The boy had the metabolism of a hummingbird. Today, Pickle was in an even bigger hurry. Today was a half day because all the teachers had some conference to go to. After-school activities had been canceled. There would be no late buses. The principal had announced that morning that the school would be closed up and locked at noon. This meant Pickle, and of course Shelley and Reed, were in for an afternoon of the great snacks Mrs. Gerard put out for the twins and their little brother, Ori, on special days like this. Even on normal days, stuff like homemade pizzas, veggie egg rolls, and grilled sandwiches were the typical after-school eats at the Gerard house. But on special days, Mrs. Gerard went over the top. Pickle, Shelley, and their little brother Ori were beyond lucky. Their mom was home to make them hot food in the afternoon, and then another great meal later on in the evening. Reed was lucky if he could scrounge up a few pretzels when he got home to his empty house. Luckily, he usually got to go home with the twins. If he didn't, he'd have been even skinnier than he was. Pickle started trotting up the aisle toward the door as Reed picked up his project and tried to figure out how to shove it into his backpack. He didn't take his eyes off of Pickle as he folded and refolded the project's robotic arms, so he saw when Julius stuck out his foot and tripped Pickle. Pickle, who wasn't the most coordinated kid anyway, lost his balance and flew forward into the desk in front of Julius. Pickle's big nose led the way wherever his face went, so his nose took the brunt of the impact when it hit the corner of the desk. Blood spurted from Pickle's nostrils as Julius snorted out a high-pitched laugh. Miss Billings, who had been gathering a stack of books and preparing to leave the room, didn't see a thing. Neither did anyone else. Everyone was too focused on where they were going. Even Shelley had her head down as she collapsed her dog-sized exoskeleton into a puppy-sized one. This was a particularly clever part of her project, Reed thought. She told him if she could figure out how to downsize Thales too, without hurting him of course, she'd patent collapsible dogs and become a billionaire. Reed's muscles bunched as he watched his friend try to stop the spurting blood with one hand. Reed wanted to help Pickle, and he wanted to confront Julius, but he knew where it would lead him if he put himself in the middle. As if reading Reed's mind, Julius turned and smiled. Julius's usually pointed canine teeth seemed to gleam under the classroom's fluorescent lighting. Not for the first time, Reed fantasized that Julius was a vampire, who could be vaporized by a stake through the heart. If Julius had a heart. Reed clenched his fists as Pickle ran from the room, clutching his robot with one hand and his bloody nose with the other. Before Reed could tell Shelley what had happened, she got her act together and hurried after Pickle, calling, "Pickle, wait up!" Julius gave Reed the evil eye for another few seconds. Then he turned to gather up his floppy exoskeleton. All the other kids filed out of the room. Reed lingered. He wanted to say something to Julius. What was it Shelley called Julius the other day when they were talking about him? Oh yeah, she'd said he was an ignominious, odious reprobate. Reed mentally repeated the words. They sounded ridiculous. Only Shelley could get away with saying something like that. "What are you staring at?" Julius asked Reed. Reed looked around the room. He realized he and Julius were alone in the room. He hated that his palms had started sweating and his breathing was becoming faster. Why had he let Julius get to him? Julius stopped trying to gather up his suit. Instead, he carefully laid it out. He grinned at Reed. "Bet you wish you could build something like this, huh, moron?" Reed didn't answer. He wanted to pick up his backpack and leave, but something kept him in the room. What? He didn't know. It sure wasn't the company, which sucked. It wasn't the decor, which he found intimidating. And it wasn't the smell, which was a cross between chalk and soldering. "I don't even know what you're doing in this class." Julius sneered. "I mean, your runty little friend may be a mini-freak, but at least he has a few brain cells. And your other friend, that weird-haired chewing chick, is an uppity cow, but with a little makeup, she wouldn't be bad to look at." And she has brain cells too. You've got nothing going for you. You're a freak and nothing can make you worth looking at. And on top of that, you're all air up there, aren't you? Julius leaned forward and flicked a finger between Reed's eyes. Reed tightened his fists, and Julius noticed. What are you going to do? Hit me? Didn't you see what I did to your pickled friend? Julius laughed his beyond annoying laugh. I didn't even have to lift a finger. I just moved my foot, and now he has a bloody nose. Just think of what I could do to you without giving it much effort. Reed swallowed. Julius had just called Reed an ugly, stupid freak, and yet Reed was still standing there, as if he couldn't talk. Reed hated being called a freak, and he hated being called ugly. Yeah, Reed was a bit of an outcast. When his mom had died, he hadn't seen the point in trying to get along with anyone. He'd separated himself from his friends, using his overwhelming grief as a fence to erect a barrier between himself and the world. Only Pickle and Shelley had bothered to climb the fence. And no, Reed wasn't much to look at. The truth was, he was not unlike Pickle in the looks department. Skinny, with unusually long arms, his pronounced brow ridged, and jutting jaw gave him more of an ape-like appearance than he wanted to admit. More than once, Julius called him Monkey Face when he was younger. Now that his dad let him grow his curly brown hair long, he was able to disguise his primate features a little. If only he had an ape's strength. He still wanted to say something to Julius. No, forget saying something. He wanted to do something, but he couldn't. Why did he think things would be different in high school than they had been in grade school? Julius lifted his exoskeleton. See this here? I was going to use it to be stronger and faster. But I don't need to be stronger and faster. I'm already strong and fast. I figured out a better use. I'm going to get this thing working perfectly, and I'm going to hold you down and put you into it. Then, I'll control the exoskeleton, and it will make you do whatever I command it to do. You'll have to be my servant. I'm going to make you wait on me all day long. You'll carry my books, tie my shoes, get me food, clean up after me. I'm even going to make you dance for me. What do you think about that, loser? Would you like to dance like a monkey for me? Reed still didn't speak. It was like he'd be turned to stone. All he could do was stand there and watch Julius lean over and tinker with his exoskeleton. Julius looked up and laughed at Reed. Cat got your tongue? Julius lifted up his exoskeleton suit. Want to see it in action? It's pretty amazing if I do say so myself. Julius began fitting the suit to his long limbs and V-shaped torso. The metal shell lay over Julius's limbs. A shoulder strap, chest strap, and hip strap, along with clamps at the wrists and ankles, kept everything in place. Reed, biting the insides of his cheek hard enough to draw blood, remained rooted to the spot, watching. Outside the classroom, students laughed and called to each other as they headed to the buses, lined up outside the school. Inside the classroom, it was nearly silent, except for the clicks and snaps of Julius fitting himself to his robotic skeleton. See here? Julius held up his arms. He indicated his wrist, then pointed to his ankles. I've equipped the exoskeleton with locking mechanisms, so once I get you in it, I can keep you in it. Reed watched Julius struggle with some of the joints of his exoskeleton. Julius shifted the framework on his body, then adjusted the suit's piston cylinders. Outside, a couple of buses started their engines, and a baritone rumbling vibrated the walls of the school. If Reed didn't leave soon, he'd have to walk to the Gerard's house. He'd have to walk over 7 miles. All because he stood here like a paralyzed mute for the last several minutes. He shook his head to try to get his brain rebooted. Julius, heavy with the exoskeleton riding his body, leaned down and fiddled with the wires leading to the skeleton's circuits. Reed wished he had the guts to reach out and shove Julius across the room. Him and his stupid exoskeleton. But it was a good thing he didn't. A second later, Reed was glad he wasn't touching Julius. A radiant flash burst up like fireworks as a power surge sparked in the exoskeleton. Julius's body twitched. His eyes widened, and he went rigid for several seconds. In those seconds, Reed's mind bizarrely thought of the previous day's word of the day. Shelley shared every one of them with him. He forgot most of them, but he remembered Fulgurant. which meant flashing and lightning. That power surge was fulgurant, he thought. With curiosity for what was going to happen next, Reed watched the stiffness leave Julius's body. Julius wavered on his feet, lost his balance, and fell back on his desk. Shaking his head, he groped for his chair and slid into it. He put his head down, and for what felt like a long 20 seconds, Julius was perfectly still. Was he alive? Reed blinked and studied Julius's inert form. Then Reed's gaze landed on the wrist and ankle joints of the suit. Finally, Reed moved. Stepping over to Julius, Reed quickly locked the wrist and ankle joints. They fitted together with a satisfying snick. As soon as they did, Reed stepped back and grinned. That would teach the ignominious odious reprobate. Reed picked up his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He watched as Julius opened his eyes. It took a second for him to get oriented, but when he did, he attempted to strip off the exoskeleton. "Oops," Reed said. He backed toward the classroom door. He finally found his voice. "I must have locked you in. My bad." Julius jerked his arms, yanking to free them from the restraints of his skeletal suit. He kicked his legs. With his right hand, he grabbed at the exoskeleton, hugging with his left hand. He grunted and strained. The skeleton wouldn't budge. "What the hell did you do, punk?" Julius yelled. "Unlock me!" "I don't think so," Reed said. "Do what I tell you. Unlock me!" Julius's face was a mottled mix of red and purple, and his eyes looked like they were bulging out of his head. Spittle clung to the corners of his mouth. Reed shrugged and grinned. He couldn't remember the last time he was this pleased with himself. Not that he thought through what he was doing. What was the point of what he'd just done? Was he just messing with Julius? Or was he going to leave Julius in the suit overnight? Could he do that? Why not? He'd get in trouble was why not. Julius would tell the teachers what Reed did. But all Reed would have to do was deny it. If he made sure Julius was unlocked by morning, why would anyone suspect Reed of anything? Everyone knew he was pretty much a wuss. No one would believe he had the courage to do this. "Unlock me!" Julius commanded again. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His jaw jutted, and he kept opening and closing his fists. At this point, Reed really had no choice but to leave Julius here all night. If he let Julius out now, Julius was going to beat the crap out of him. Even if he unlocked Julius and ran, Reed probably wouldn't outrun the guy. Julius was crazy fast, and Reed was an athletic spaz. If he waited until morning, there would be enough people around that Julius wouldn't touch him. The decision basically made itself. Julius was going to be locked in overnight. The idea buoyed Reed so much he felt like he was floating. "I'm going to do you a favor," Reed said, happy that he had something clever to say. "I'm going to leave you here in your suit overnight, so you get an idea of what it feels like to have someone treat you the way you treat everyone else. Maybe your robot can teach you a thing or two." "Hey!" Julius tried to get up, but his exoskeleton was contracted and stiff. It was acting like a full-body cast, keeping Julius's body locked in a seated position. "Have fun," Reed called as he sprinted from the room. Before he left the classroom, he shut off the lights. "Get back here, you stupid ape!" Julius screamed. "Do you know what you've done? I'm going to kill you!" The last few words came out as a nearly unintelligible screech as Reed pulled the door closed. Julius began bellowing. "I'm going to rip your head off and flush it down the toilet. I'm going to tear you apart limb from limb. Get back in here and unlock this!" Reed laughed. For some reason, Julius's threats, which normally would have reduced Reed to quivering jelly, sounded funny. For once, Julius had no power. Reed had it all. Reed looked around the empty hallway. He was alone. Good. This whole wing was probably empty by now. As an auxiliary hall near the back of the school, it wasn't used outside of class hours. No one would find Julius even if he yelled his head off. "Come back here and let me out of this thing!" Julius screamed. You can't leave me in here like this! Reed grinned. He turned and ran through the school, hoping he wasn't too late to catch his bus. Because Mr. Jansen, the bus driver, was always looking out for him, Reed didn't miss his bus. He made a total fool of himself, waving his arms around and shouting as Mr. Jansen started to pull away from the curb. But he got the driver's attention. Mr. Jansen stopped the bus a few feet from the curb and opened the bus's doors. The driver of one of the buses farther down the row behind Reed's bus honked. Stumbling up the stairs into the bus, Reed gasped, "Thanks," to Mr. Jansen, who shook his gray-haired head and winked at Reed. "Cutting it close, my boy. Cutting it close." Reed sucked in some air. "Sorry." "Life happens," Mr. Jansen said. "We adjust." He smiled at Reed. "You can take your seat." Reed scanned the interior of the bus. One of the cheerleaders gave him a disgusted look. Reed ignored her and looked for Shelley and Pickle. He knew they'd be at the back of the bus, and he knew they'd saved him a seat. Keeping his gaze on his feet and the ISO-scuffed rubber flooring, Reed hurried to his friends. He slid in next to Pickle. As soon as Reed's butt hit the hard maroon vinyl seat, Mr. Jansen released the brakes. The bus hissed, lurched, and rumbled away from the school. Reed looked at Pickle's nose. It was hard not to. Red and swollen, smeared with blood. Pickle's nose was more prominent than ever. And now, he had little white tissue rolls sticking out of each nostril. Given that his nose was beaky, Pickle thought he looked like a big bird sucking up white worms. "Does it hurt?" Reed asked. Pickle, as usual, was doing some kind of numbers puzzle. He glanced up at Reed. "Huh?" Pickle made a funny cross-eyed face in an attempt to look at his injured beak. Reed suppressed a smile. Pickle shrugged. "Yeah, not the first time, though. I can ignore it. Sorry." "Why? What did you do?" "Nothing." Pickle returned to his puzzle. Reed glanced at Shelley. She was reading, also as usual. The bus smelled like diesel exhaust, sweat, peanuts, and bubble gum. Its engine sounded like a contented snore of a sleeping dragon. The sound helped tension and adrenaline drain from Reed's system. The bus gained speed as it turned out of the school's driveway onto the road. Reed looked out the window. The high school was tucked into the back of an older neighborhood, so the first few blocks after they left the school were full of big trees and pretty green lawns. Reed usually liked looking at all that greenery. He would stare at the lawns with envy. His front yard was mostly dirt. Today, Reed wasn't seeing anything he was looking at. He was back in the robotics classroom with Julius. His mind was focused on Julius, locked into his exoskeleton. Julius's face nearly purple with rage. "In the Dark Ages," Shelley said, "harsh torture was commonly used to punish those who broke the law." Reed flinched. "What?" He turned to stare at Shelley. As always, she sat in the seat behind Pickle and Reed. Her massive backpack, an extra book bag, took up the rest of the seat. Did she know what he had done? Her attention on her book, Shelley continued. When someone violated civil law, torture would be done in the town square. Public display of the consequences for lawlessness was thought to be a deterrent. Oh, she was reading. Of course she was. She loved to share what she was learning, and she often read aloud on the bus, and at home, and at lunch, and in the hallways at school. She read pretty much everywhere. Today, she was reading her history homework. Shelley was in AP World History, because she read so many history books outside of school that she was beyond the normal history curriculum. She wasn't just a science geek. She was an information geek. Reed relaxed his shoulders and returned his attention to the window. When it left behind the neighborhood, the bus route ran along the main drag lined with strip malls and car dealerships. Reed liked this stretch too, because he enjoyed looking at the cars. He liked to imagine himself driving them, and he picked a different make and model every day. Concentrating, he put himself at the wheel of a new bright yellow Mustang. Shelley's voice, however, ruined this fantasy. Torturers were very creative in the Middle Ages, Shelley read. They came up with truly morbid ways of inflicting excruciating pain. The Judas cradle, for example, impaled a seated victim for several days, with blood-curdling names like the Beast Ripper and the Pair of Anguish. Medieval torture devices were a testament to human ingenuity. Torture. Was what I did to Julius torture? Reed's chest tightened. Yeah, it probably was. Being stuck was at least a mild form of torture, especially in an exoskeleton with no way to move, or eat, or drink, or get to the bathroom. It wasn't the Judas cradle, but it wasn't nice either. After the malls and car lots, their bus route wound through an industrial park, and then it passed a farm, before turning into a newer subdivision. Most of the bus's stops were in this subdivision, which was stuffed full of houses that, though good size, mostly looked alike. Reed didn't care about the houses, so he stopped registering individual things. Now, he saw just blurs of color, and Julius stuck in that metal framework. Reed's dad, who did the best he could to be a single dad to Reed and his sister Alexa, was fond of saying that you couldn't solve a problem at the level of the problem. Reed wasn't a genius like his friends, but he was smart enough to know that meant that lowering himself to the level of Julius's meanness wasn't the way to handle the jerk. But still, after what Julius did to Pickle, wasn't that justification enough to lock Julius into the exoskeleton he was so proud of? And what about what Julius said to Reed? About locking Reed into the exoskeleton? Didn't Julius deserve to get a taste of his own medicine? Reed started to unwind his muscles again. Yeah, what he did wasn't so bad. It was justice. The bus went through a pothole, and everybody popped off their seats for a nanosecond. When they all landed again, Shelley poked Reed's shoulder. He turned to look at her. "Listen to this," she said. "You won't believe it." "What?" Reed asked. Pickle said nothing. He kept inking in the answers to his puzzle. One of the most commonly used forms of torture was called the wheel. Shelley read from her thick, musty-smelling book. Those condemned to being constrained in this way had prolonged torture ahead of them. They were held in place, unable to free themselves. Reed stared at Shelley. What was she doing? Was she messing with him? Held in place, unable to free themselves. It sounded like she was talking about Julius. Maybe she knew what he had done after all. But how? It was sometimes called the breaking wheel, Shelley read on. Reed blew out air. No, she didn't know what he'd done. It was just a coincidence that she was reading about torture devices. They called it that, she continued, because it used to crush the bones of the condemned. Ew, huh? Shelley looked at Reed with wide eyes. Then she returned her gaze to the book and read on. The device was designed for torture lasting over multiple days. The wheel was made up of many radial spokes, and the person subjected to it was tied to the whole wheel before a club or cudgel was used to beat their limbs. This process reduced the human being into a mutilated bag of bones, what one onlooker described as a writhing, moaning monster with bloody tentacles. That's gross, Pickle said without looking up from his puzzle. Totally, Reed agreed. He tried not to think about what Julius was experiencing now. But hey, at least Julius wasn't tied to a medieval torture device, right? Julius was restrained, and as time passed, he'd be uncomfortable. But he wasn't in any pain. No one was standing over him, beating him with a cudgel. Whatever that was. He was just trapped. Shelley continued to read about medieval torture, but Reed tuned her out. He turned back toward the window. The bus was stopped at a corner, and he watched a mom holding hands with a little kid who held a red balloon. The balloon bobbed in the air, following the little kid's movements because it was tied to the kid's wrist. Reed thought about Julius's big wrists. Maybe he should go back to the school and unlock the exoskeleton after their study session this evening. A few hours would be enough to punish Julius for his nastiness. That way, Julius would learn his lesson. But Reed wouldn't stoop to the level of torture. Yeah, That's what Reed would do. Except, how would he get away from Julius before Julius tried to kill him? Reed chewed on his lower lip. He sat up straight and smiled. He knew what he could do. He'd just unlock one of Julius's hands, then jump back and run before Julius could grab him. Julius, stiff from his confinement, would take at least half a minute to unlock his other wrists and ankles. And in that time, Reed could get far enough away to hide. Once Julius was gone, Reed could go home. And after that? Well, he'd deal with that when the time came. But until then, he was going to have some good food at the Gerard's house and hang out with his friends. He was going to put Julius out of his mind and enjoy the rest of his free time that day. He deserved it. Just like Julius deserved what was happening to him.